On June 3rd, 1943, a group of U.S. sailors returned from a night out, accusing a group of Mexican Americans of attacking them. In their retelling of the events, they specifically noted that their attackers were wearing zoot suits, a unique and eye-catching style that consisted of broad-shouldered draped jackets, balloon-leg trousers, and sometimes a flamboyant hat. The events that would follow these accusations would change the course of history, as thousands of people would take to the streets over the span of a week, rioting. These riots became known as the Zoot Suit Riots. On the following day, June 4th, uniformed sailors ordered taxis to take them to a predominantly Mexican-American community, seeking out those wearing zoot suits. That night, and for the following week, hundreds of U.S. military personnel went on a rampage in Los Angeles, California, attacking hundreds of Mexican-Americans who wore the zoot suit style of dress. Many zoot suiters, as the media labeled them, were beaten by servicemen and stripped of their zoot suits on the spot. The worst of the rioting occurred on June 7th, when thousands of U.S. servicemen and citizens took to the streets of downtown Los Angeles, attacking anyone who wore the zoot suit style of dress, as well as any other members of minority groups. Following these days of rioting and conflict, police arrested hundreds of Mexican-American youths, including many who had already been attacked by servicemen. In contrast, very few servicemen were arrested. Through the patrol of military police, the numbers of attacks dwindled, and by June 10th, the rioting had mainly come to an end. In the following weeks, however, similar violence occurred in other states across America. On June 22nd, 1943, following weeks of violence and local unrest, the Los Angeles CIO Council published a statement on what they labeled serious race rioting. The council noted that the foundation of the riots was relatively innocent disputes between groups of U.S. sailors and youths of Mexican origin. The main contributor to the violence, according to the council, was the press, which reported on incidents with the intention of making people angry and violent. Irresponsible and misleading accounts of the events blew the true occurrences out of proportion as half-facts, and in many cases plain lies and imaginary occurrences were reported by the press. In addition to the press, the CIO Council blamed the police for failing to act quickly and decisively to restore and keep order. Police and sheriff deputies stood by and did nothing, looking the other way while servicemen searched the streets and beat innocent civilians. Civilians whose only crime was that their skin was darker than those who were trying to fight them. In many cases, the police actually encouraged and helped the groups of sailors. The final contributor to the chaos was an already existing wave of panic regarding the problems of minority racial groups. This was a fundamental aspect of why the race rioting broke out. Tension had been steadily increasing for 6 to 8 months prior before the riots, and as a result of the irresponsible reporting of the initial events, this tension reached its boiling point. The tension and mass hysteria regarding the groups of minority youths was like a pool of gasoline growing day by day, and it was not the conflict between the sailors and youth that was the spark that began the riots. The reporting from the media was the spark that set this pool of gasoline aflame, and as the fire roared on, the actions of the police kept this fire burning. The press's role in the Zoot Suit riot cannot be understated. Their influence and contributions began over a year before the riots in Los Angeles, as the local press, particularly the Heist newspaper, whipped up anti-Mexican views and attitudes throughout communities by headlining every incident in which a Mexican American was arrested. These headlines were accompanied by photographs of Mexican Americans in zoot suits. This effectively created a climate of fear that slowly turned into a dangerous hunger for revenge. This need for revenge resulted by being convinced that the careless and dangerous Mexican Americans were overrunning their city. Research spanning back 10 years prior to riots revealed that during the months prior to these incidents, newspapers had continuously replaced references to Mexicans with the term Zoot Suiter, a term that carries negative connotations throughout the community. The term Zoot Suiter painted the image of a social outcast, lacking moral character and roaming the streets. The term was also associated with sexual offenses and other crimes such as gang activity and even dodging the draft. As the papers continuously used the phrase Zoot Suiters in reference to Mexicans, people viewed all Mexicans as Zoot Suiters, all Zoot Suiters as criminals, and therefore, to many of the white population, all Mexican Americans were criminals. This view would fuel aggressive crowd behavior towards Mexicans. Once the riots were underway, the stereotyped image of Mexican Americans continued to be pushed by the press in a series of inaccurate accounts of the conflict. Even Time magazine, which took a stand in criticizing Los Angeles newspapers, titled its story, "The Zoot Suit War." These false retellings of events were then spread by the city's major newspapers and became the official version of what happened. These false reportings began when the press reported that the U.S. servicemen had only acted in self-defense, as Mexican Americans were the main aggressors. While there were some instances in which Mexican Americans started the attacks, it was clear that the servicemen were overwhelmingly starting the violence. The irresponsible reporting continued when, just as the violence and chaos seemed like it was going to die down, local newspapers published stories warning of an armed attack by Zoot Suiters that night. The worst of violence occurred the night of the publication, as soldiers, sailors, and white civilians took to the streets following headlines that Zooters threaten Los Angeles police. We're meeting 500 strong tonight, and we're going to kill every cop we see. These predictions were made after nothing more than an anonymous call to the press and police. Alongside the blatantly false and irresponsible reporting of the riots, the press added fuel to the fire by giving the impression that all young Mexican-American participants were dangerous criminals, gangsters, and hoodlums. While juvenile crimes were increasing in Los Angeles since the beginning of World War II, it had risen less among Mexican Americans than any other ethnic group in America. Through race baiting, using loaded language, and advancing the white version of events, the press turned a small fight into a full-blown race riot that lasted for over a week. The actions of the press in the months leading up to the riots created a wave of mass hysteria throughout white communities. This hysteria continued to develop, filling white citizens with anger and frustration as they waited for any opportunity to seek revenge on the Mexican-American population. Not only did the press convince the communities that they needed to seek revenge, but they also created a story that would motivate these angered white citizens to take to the streets.